The Great Diamond Syndicate by Nicholas Carter, Chapter 15, A Desperate Game. A sinister smile flashed over the white face of the man at the desk. "There are many methods of executing the orders of the Great Diamond Syndicate," he said, "and there are forms of death calculated to break the most obstinate will. Besides, the safety of your beloved Chick ought to count for something with you." The detective strained at his bonds and ground his teeth in impotent rage. "I'd like to have half an hour with you with bare knuckles," he said, as the man at the desk gazed upon him in triumph. "I think I could teach you a few points in humanity. Let me tell you now that the American head of the Great Diamond Syndicate is not equal to his job. In short, is a very cheap fool." "I am not a passionate person," said the other. "Proceed." "If you were fit for the position," continued Nick, "you would never have permitted me to regain consciousness." "We are looking to you for help in securing your diamonds," was the cool reply. "Then, having made this mistake, you should never have confided the secrets of your syndicate to me. We decided to bring you down a peg or two before your death, to show you how little you were really capable of when pitted against men of ability and courage. To humiliate me, in fact? To punish you." "What do you suppose I'll do to your syndicate when I get out of here?" asked Nick. "You'll never get out," was the reply. "You are as good as dead now." Nick smiled and turned his face to the wall. He was listening intently for some indication of the presence of his assistants. He had no idea how they would get to him, but he was satisfied that get to him they would. Presently there came a ring at the door. Nick knew by the sound that he was on the second floor of the house. He had little doubt that he was still in the house occupied wholly or in part by the African fortune teller. He was now convinced that the woman was a confederate of the diamond thieves. Nick listened with his heart beating wildly as he heard the front door open. He was naturally anxious about the safety of his assistants and Joseph. He had not the least doubt that the thieves had actually planned a robbery at his house. As fate would have it, there was no one in the house save Joseph, if Chick and Patsy had obeyed his telephone call. The thieves might really secure his diamonds, but that was not the chief cause of his anxiety. "There will be a long score to settle when I get out of this," he thought. Presently the man arose from the desk and approached the door leading into the hall. There were now loud voices out there, and Nick was listening with all his senses alert. The man opened the door a trifle. "What is coming off out there?" he demanded, in French. "This fool servant won't let me into the house," came a voice which sounded remarkably like that of the alleged reporter who had guided Nick to the place. It was like the young fellow's voice, and yet it was not. There was a note in it which Nick recognized. He was satisfied that it was Chick playing a desperate game. "What is the matter, Maurice?" asked the man, standing in the doorway. "He doesn't make correct replies," was the answer. "I do, too. He's a fool." "Bring him up here and keep a strong hold on him," commanded the chief of the diamond thieves. "I'll go up there all right," was the reply, "but if he touches me, I'll knock his head off. I ought to know all about this den, if I have fuddled my head a bit with drink, and I have been with you longer than he has." Nick saw the chief step back to his desk and grasp a revolver. "This is a counterfeit," he said, looking toward Nick with a smile. "It is probably one of your men trying to break into the game. We'll let him up and see what he looks like. Then we'll settle him for good." As the chief stepped back to the door, Nick gave a sharp call of warning, which he knew that Chick would understand. The chief turned angrily in his direction for just an instant. In that instant there was a quick, heavy blow below, and a fall. Then a cool breath of air from the street swept through the hall and up the stairs to the room where Nick lay. The chief of the diamond thieves turned back into the room. There was a look of brutal rage on his face. "You were right," he said. "I presume too much on the competence of our guards. You know too much to be allowed to leave this place alive." As he leveled his revolver at the helpless detective, there came a rush on the outer staircase, and he paused, as if uncertain whether it would not be better to turn his weapon on the intruders. At that critical moment there came a sharp call for help, seemingly from the rear room, and he bounded in that direction. "Help! I am being strangled!" The voice appeared to be that of a woman. The would-be murderer, when he reached the room whence the cry had seemed to proceed, found it entirely unoccupied. With a muttered oath, he sprang back to the helpless detective on the couch, and again lifted his weapon. He was too late to accomplish the murder of his prisoner. Chick, disguised as a young man who had played the part of the reporter, swept into the room and struck down the revolver. The bullet buried itself in the carpet. Behind Chick came Patsy and Danny, Nick's chauffeur, who had entered the lower hall when Chick had opened the door after putting the guard out with a blow. The would-be murderer disappeared in the rear room before Chick could lay hands on him, and closed the door in the faces of his pursuers. They had the barrier open in a trice, but the chief of the diamond thieves had disappeared. An open door showing a private staircase leading to the basement revealed the manner of his flight. While the other two hastened down the staircase in hot pursuit, Chick turned back to his chief. "Rather close call that," he said. "It is a wonder the fellow did not shoot before we could get into the room." "His attention was attracted elsewhere," said Nick, with a smile as Chick released him from his bonds. "I don't understand," said the assistant. "I surely thought it was all off with you. What happened?" "There was a call for help from the back room," said Nick, with a grin. "I see," said Chick. "Some of your ventriloquism. Well, it saved your life, all right. What next?" In a few words he informed Chick of the situation. "I must get home at once," he said. Just then Patsy and Danny made their appearance. "It's no use," Patsy said. "The house is empty. I can't understand how they got away so handily." "Then the game is about played out so far as this place is concerned," said Nick, "and we may as well take our departure for the present." He made a quick inspection of the two desks, gathered the few papers they held into a package, and turned to the door. "Call the police," he said to Chick, "and leave them in charge of the building. We may have further use for some of the traps here. Wait! Here is a phone." He called his private number and waited impatiently. At length the voice of Joseph came over the wire. "Have you had visitors tonight?" asked Nick. "We certainly have," came the reply, with a tinge of triumph in the tones. "Did they get into the house?" asked Nick anxiously. "No, sir," was the reply. "I made short work of the thieves. One was wounded and taken to the hospital, and the others escaped." After some further conversation, Nick hung up the receiver. "This has been a bad night for the Great Diamond Syndicate," he said. "This is a new one on me," said Chick. And in a few words, Nick explained the interview with the chief of the syndicate. "Do you think he was telling the truth?" asked the assistant. "He was certainly correct about the attempt to rob my house," replied Nick. "But it does not seem possible that such a syndicate as he told of could exist in this age of the world." "There are strange things connected with criminal life," said the detective. "I can see how such an organization as he described could be made to pay large dividends, and there is no knowing what thieves will do. London is headquarters for all manner of strange syndicates. Nothing is impossible over there." "It sounds like romance," said Chick. "Anyway," continued Nick, "we can soon learn the truth or falsity of the fellow's statements. He will give himself away before long, for he is vain and proud of his skill in criminal work. Just imagine his telling me all about his syndicate." "He only wanted to show you what could be done in spite of the officers of the law," said Chick. "Besides, he sought to make you look like 30 cents, as the boys on the Bowery say." "They are a bold lot," said Nick. "Think of their sending that young man to the hotel to bring me here! However, their scheme worked to our advantage rather than to their own. By the way, where did you get that makeup?" "I watched the fellow at the Wisconsin, and saw you go off with him," was the reply. "I saw what you were working, and followed on as you directed. When you came in here, I ducked away and got this suit. Pretty near correct, eh?" "It is about the thing," replied Nick. "Listen!" There was an alarm of fire in the street. and then fire apparatus stopped in front of the building. Chick opened the door to the hall and looked out. The whole place was in flames. The detectives darted toward the private staircase, seeking escape by way of the basement, but were there met by a column of flame. Nick threw open the windows, and fire ladders soon made their appearance. It was clear that the lower part of the structure was little better than a furnace. "They hardly succeeded in burning us alive," said Chick, as the four men stood on the pavement below. "That was a fool trick, it seems to me." "The idea," said Nick, "was undoubtedly to destroy the papers and identifying records of the Great Diamond Syndicate. In this they only partially succeeded, for I have quite a mess of documents in my pocket. The house, however, seems to be doomed to destruction." This was indeed the fact, for the building burned to the ground. It was afterward discovered that the basement had been filled with combustible material, for use in just such an emergency. It was clear to the detectives that the Great Diamond Syndicate took due care of its secrets. It is true that the chief, believing Nick Carter to be as good as dead, had talked of the syndicate to him, but he had done this principally through vanity, and with the purpose of showing how the keenest detectives of the day had been outwitted by the superior wisdom and courage of the mighty syndicate. Chapter 16. More Trouble. As Nick thought over, word for word, the talk of the diamond thief, he could not see that his communications had much injured the syndicate. He had informed the detective that there was such a syndicate, and that was about all. However, this was something to start with, especially as the papers of the syndicate had been captured. Indeed, Nick had already suspected the presence of a great conspiracy in the matter of the robbery. He had understood that it was not the work of one man. The discovery that the murder had been committed by a woman who wore clothing made in Paris had started this train of thought. His experiences at the house on Houston Street, independent of the admission of the chief thief, had confirmed his earlier notions. "Well," said Nick, "they have done the best thing they could under the circumstances. This blaze scatters the American branch of the Great Diamond Syndicate. Only for the papers I have in my possession, the very name might be something in the nature of a dream, for all the talk of the chief thief." "Have you looked at the papers?" asked Chick. "Just enough to discover that they really deal with the doings of some powerful syndicate," was the reply. "Unless I am very much mistaken, we shall get no names or incriminating facts from them." "What's the next move?" asked Chick. "I shall go to the office until morning," was the reply. "I have some work to do there, and I can get a short sleep on the couch." "It is almost morning now." "Well, we'll meet at the office at 8:00, said Nick. And at 8:00, Nick, Chick, and Patsy sat in the private room of the downtown office, which Nick had lately taken with the object of having two headquarters from which to work. "Now," said Nick, turning to his first assistant, "the chief thief mentioned last night by name 4 diamond collections which have been stolen by the syndicate. I remember the main features of the crimes, but of course I know nothing of the details. What I want you to do is to take up these cases and learn all about them. It may be that the hands of the syndicate's agents may show in some of the details. It may be that you can trace the finger marks of one person through all the robberies. Locate all the persons, high and low, who might have taken the diamonds in each case." Chick made a hasty note on his private memorandum and said, "Have you been to the Wisconsin this morning?" "I have not been out of the office," was the reply. "You will find something doing up there," said Chick. "Wait," said Nick. "Let me get the story firsthand. You turn this assignment over to Patsy, and come with me to the Wisconsin." The detectives were not long in getting to the hotel. There Nick learned of the occurrences of the night. "Have you heard from Maynard this morning?" he asked of the night clerk, who, pale and distressed, seemingly because of what had taken place, lingered about the corridors instead of going to his room. "He is no worse," was the reply. "I have just come from there. It seems that he recognized the people who struck him down." "Does he mention names?" No, he only says, I know you both. Don't strike me. Strange thing all along." "How did the assailants get into the room?" asked Nick. "That's what puzzles me," was the reply. "I certainly did not let them in." "Where is the elevator boy who was on watch last night?" "He is asleep upstairs. I told him not to leave the building." "Bring him down." But the elevator boy was not upstairs. He was not in the hotel at all. "I am sorry for this," said the clerk, "because I wanted to clear myself in another matter." Nick scented more trouble. "What is it?" he asked. "Well," said the clerk, evidently very much frightened, "you gave me a bundle last night, and asked me to keep it until you personally came for it. Did you get it during the night?" Nick saw what the new trouble was, and was angry, but he gave no evidence of the fact. "I did not," he replied. "Well, the boy gave the bundle out last night. He stated that you called for it." "At what time was it given out?" "Quite early in the morning." "After the assault on Maynard?" "Yes, sir, so he said." "Where were you?" "I dozed off and left the boy in charge." "Is it usual to leave a boy on watch?" "No, sir, only " "Never mind that now. What did the boy say about it?" "Just said you came after the package." Nick was not satisfied that the clerk was telling the truth. He was very much annoyed at the loss of the clothes. "I did not think you had been here," said the clerk, and was angry with the boy. "And you scolded him, eh?" "Yes, sir." "Do you think he will return?" "I do not, sir." Nick was provoked enough to lock the clerk up, but he realized that, even if he was in partnership with the thieves, better results could be obtained by leaving him at liberty. "Do you think he belongs to the Great Diamond Syndicate?" asked Chick, as the two walked away. "It is all a guess," was the reply. "I have an idea that he got that alleged reporter into the house last night," said the assistant. Chapter 17 More Surprises "The alleged reporter," said Nick, "was probably waiting about the house. He knew that a murder had been committed, and his orders probably were to get a line on what was being done. He might have bribed the clerk or the boy. Probably he did." "Yes, that is the story," said Chick. "The syndicate did not expect that a murder would be necessary, and those in charge of the case were alarmed. They doubtless had a notion that they would be all right if they could only get you out of the way." "What about this Mantell?" asked Nick. "Do you think he is in the game?" "He made the appointment which kept Maynard downtown with his diamonds," was the reply, "and he made it only when he knew that the diamonds were in sight." "But he was not at the café until after Townsend left," said the assistant. "Anyway, we'll look him up," said Nick. "There is one thing certain," said Chick, "and that is, the case will be won if Maynard ever recovers so as to be able to give the names of the people he saw in room 44 before he was struck down." "We can't afford to wait for that," said Nick. "The robbers and the murderer must be caught at once, if at all." "And the diamonds?" "I am no longer interested in the diamonds." This conversation had taken place, in low tones, in the hallway near to the door of room 43. The hall was deserted except for a chambermaid loitering at the farther end. It was too early for the guests to be astir. Nick now unlocked the door to room 43 and stepped inside. As he did so, a lady who occupied room 42, directly across the hallway, opened her door and called to the maid. She handed her a piece of silver as she came up to where she stood, leaning out into the corridor. "Kindly go to the office and ask for mail for Mrs. Morton," she said. The maid hastened away. Then Mrs. Morton stepped across the hall and stood before the door of room 43. Nick had not yet left the door, but was standing close to it on the inside. As the woman approached, he listened for a moment, and then opened the door. The woman started back in dismay. "Something you want?" asked Nick, with a smile. The woman, who was young and far from ill looking, blushed prettily. I'm ashamed of myself, she said, but I really wanted to know what was going on in the murder case, and so I listened. I'm sorry." "It doesn't matter," replied Nick. The woman sought her room, and Nick turned back to his assistant. "There is a clever crook," he said. "I wonder how she got here so soon," remarked Chick. "You might go down and talk with the clerk," said Nick. "I'll wager that she came here after the assault on Maynard." While Nick made a second and more searching examination of the room, Chick talked with the night clerk, who still insisted on hanging about the place. "The woman came here from the Grand Central Station in a carriage at 7:30, said the clerk. "She registered from Chicago, as you see. No, there was no mail for her when the maid called. What other errand did she give the maid?" "None whatever," replied the assistant. "At least none that we heard." "Well," said the clerk, "after making the inquiry at the desk, the maid went out to the café next to the reading room and talked with one of the waiters." "You'll not lose by giving out that information," said Chick. Before the astonished clerk could make reply, Chick was upstairs in the room Nick was searching. "We are in a storm center of the Great Diamond Syndicate," said Nick, when informed of the acts of the maid. "This is a fine place to fish for clues." "But how can the maid be in the employ of the syndicate?" asked Chick. "Up to this time the thieves have had no use for any one in this house." "We'll pass on that when the time comes," said Nick. "See what I found in this room." The detectives were standing in room 44. "Red hair," said Chick. "Look at it with this glass." Chick did so. "What do you find?" asked Nick. "Bleached," was the short reply. "Exactly." Nick took more red hairs from his pocketbook. "I find," he said, "that these are from a wig." "Where did you get those?" "In room 43, last night. They were in the brush and on the collar of the coat the murderer wore." "And these hairs were found in this room?" "There on the carpet." "And that means?" "That the woman who committed the murder came back here and tried to find out what was going on. She found the room deserted and entered." "There were two of them," said Chick, pointing to a lock of black curly hair on the floor, "and one was a man, and Maynard grappled with him." "Exactly," said Nick. "And someone let her in, or let them in, rather." "And that someone knew that Maynard was being murdered." "It's a puzzle," replied Nick. "I can't for the life of me see how the Great Diamond Syndicate got into action here so quickly." "Money," said Chick. "I guess the chief thief didn't exaggerate much when he told me of the efficiency of his gang," said Nick. The detective made a little package of the articles he wished to take with him, and the two descended to the office floor. The night clerk was nowhere in sight. The day clerk was all attention. "A strange thing has just happened," he said. "Our night elevator boy was badly injured near here by the falling of a heavy jar from a high window. He had been out on some errand, it seems, and was returning." "Do you know when he left the hotel?" asked Nick. "Before I came on watch." "Do you think he was returning to the hotel?" "I don't know about that. He might not have been." "Where was the boy taken?" "To a hospital not far from the scene of the accident," was the reply. The detectives hurried to the place where the boy had been injured, and learned from the officer on the beat the name of the institution to which the boy had been taken. In a short time Nick and Chick stood in a private room of the establishment, making an examination of the clothing worn by the boy, who had not yet recovered consciousness. For a time they searched in vain. Then, at the front of the coat, appeared a narrow slit. In this was a folded paper bearing an address, and the one word, "Scatter." It seemed impossible to ascertain where the boy had put in his time between the hour of leaving the hotel and the hour of his disaster. The address was that of a cheap lodging house off the Bowery, but little could be learned there. The tough clerk said that the boy had talked with one or two lodgers and gone away. "A warning from the syndicate," said Chick. They are up to date in their methods, it appears." There was silence between the two as they walked back to the house from which the jar had fallen. "It was intended murder," said Chick. "Just a cold-blooded crime." "Well?" "The syndicate had bribed him, and used him, and were afraid he would not keep his tongue between his teeth," said Chick. "Don't jump at conclusions," said Nick. "Accidents of this sort are not uncommon in New York." "Are you going to the room from which the jar fell?" asked the assistant. "Right now," was the reply. "We may be able to get some sort of information from the people of the building." "The Great Diamond Syndicate may have gotten ahead of us," said Chick. "Say, but that must be a hot concern. They burn houses and try to knock off whoever gets in their way. I wonder if anything will eventually happen to that smart chambermaid?" Chapter 18 By the Hand of a Woman. The detectives approached the building from the opposite side of the street, keeping their eyes on the third-story windows. The officer saw them and approached. "I thought you'd come back," he said. "It's a case worth looking up. I could get no satisfaction up there. Had to return to my beat too quick." "Did you see the jar fall?" asked Nick. "I did not," was the reply. "But a woman who was passing said it was thrown from the second window on the right of the entrance, third floor. She said she saw a head and an arm out of the window as the jar fell." "What do they say up there?" "That the room is not occupied." "What sort of folks are in that building?" The policeman shrugged his shoulders. "Tough," he said. "Well, we are going up," said Nick. "I'll wait about here," said the officer, who knew Nick and his assistant quite well. "Let me know if anything happens." The two passed on up the stairs. They had, however, been seen talking with a policeman. As they reached the third floor, a rough voice asked: "What do you fellows want up here? You'd better be making yourself scarce if you want to keep your shape." The speaker was meanly dressed and generally foul in appearance. "I take it," said Nick coolly, "that you are the janitor." "What is it to you who I am?" demanded the other. "Get out!" Nick turned to his assistant. "Call the policeman," he said. "We'll cool this chap off in jail." "What have I done?" whined the janitor, seeing that he had made a mistake. "You might have thrown that jar down on the boy, for all I know," said Nick, with a wink at Chick. "What would I do such a thing for?" asked the frightened janitor. "For money," replied the detective. "Was it a murder?" asked the janitor, trembling. "It looks like it might be before long." "Then the woman did it," said the janitor. "The woman?" repeated Nick. "What woman?" "Why," was the reply, "the woman who rented the room yesterday, and who went off just a little while ago." "Just after the boy was killed?" "Yes, not 5 minutes after." "What sort of woman was it?" "Oh, I didn't notice her particularly. One of the sort that live here, I take it," answered the janitor. "Young or old?" "Middle-aged, I'd guess." "Did you rent the room to her?" "Yes, yesterday afternoon." "What did she say about her occupation?" "I asked no questions, sir. It is not always best to do so." "Well, give us a look at the room." The place was small and cheap and dirty. In the way of furniture it contained only a flat bed, a spotted washstand, a chair, and an old dresser. The detective sent the janitor away, much to his disappointment, and made a careful study of the place. "Here's more red hair," said Chick. "I wonder if this is bleached." Examination showed that it was. Nick took several articles from the chest and the top of the dresser and carried them away with him. "If the room was hired for the purpose of getting rid of the boy," said Chick, as the detectives walked away, "why should it have been taken yesterday? The boy was not in the game at that time. He was sent along that street because the window was there with the murderous heart behind it. The room was not hired because there was a plot against the boy at that time. Presently we shall doubtless know why it was engaged, and who the tenant was." "The whole case is a wonder," said Chick. "I confess that I don't know what to make of it. and it seems to me that we are not progressing very rapidly." There was an inscrutable smile on the face of the detective as he asked: "What's your notion of getting on with a case?" "Well, getting a clue to work on." "You don't see one here?" "Why, there's a woman with bleached hair, and a young man who calls himself a reporter, and the chief of the Great Diamond Syndicate, and all that, but we don't know where to look for them." "There are 2 women with red hair," said Nick, with a laugh. "2?" "Exactly." "Then the woman who killed Townsend did not occupy that room back there?" "I think not." "Hair is different, eh?" "That's the idea." "Well, there's the chief of the syndicate. We know he exists, but how are we to get to him?" "They will all come in a bunch, like sheep," said Nick, "and the Great Diamond Syndicate will be wiped off the continent." "You've got me guessing," said Chick. At noon the 2 detectives found themselves at Maynard's bedside. He was unconscious and talking wildly. "Has he mentioned any names?" asked Nick of the nurse. "Not a single one." Then Nick turned to the doctor. "Will he live?" he asked. "I think so. He is young and strong, and may recover, but he may have to learn his alphabet again." "That is another trademark of the Great Diamond Syndicate," mused Nick. "Hartley, who was one of their American agents, advocated beating people on the head until they came from the hospital mere imbeciles." Things looked suspiciously favorable to the syndicate at that time. As Chick had stated, there was no clue to the whereabouts of the persons wanted. Maynard was unconscious, and the elevator boy was in the same condition. On leaving the sick room, Nick hastened to the Townsend residence. It was a sad-faced family he met there, and for a time he delayed the important questions he had come to ask. It seemed like making little of their sorrow, to trouble his parents with matters of the law at that time. Finally he called the father aside. "You understand how difficult it is for me to break in on you at this time," he said. "But there are questions which ought to be asked now." "I will do my best to answer them," said the father. "You have heard your son speak of one Julius Mantell?" "Occasionally." "Do you know where the fellow lives?" "At the Hotel Cumberland, I think." "Have you ever met this man Julius?" "Once." "Describe him, please." "Very dark, with broad nostrils, like a Negro, thick lips, black curly hair. He speaks English with a slight French accent. I didn't like the looks of the man." "What about his eyes?" "Like a snake's." "Did you know that your son had an appointment with him last night?" "I did not." "Or with anyone?" "Not that I knew of. Is this man Mantell suspected?" "Well, he was about the café, where your son and Maynard took supper after the rehearsal. I desire to locate him. Do you know where this rehearsal was held?" The detective was given a number of West 14th Street. Chapter 19. Mantell at Bay. "It strikes me," said Chick, as the detectives left the Townsend home, "that the Great Diamond Syndicate is giving us the fight of our lives." "It appears to be all that the chief declared it to be," said Dick. "A powerful organization, officered by cunning scoundrels. I think this man Mantell knows something about the syndicate." "We have no proof, yet I have been thinking the same thing," replied Nick. "And that is why I went to the Townsend home, to see if it were possible to get a line on the fellow. I did not succeed very well, but I have another plan in my mind." "Hunt him up and work the 3rd degree?" asked Chick. "Exactly," replied the chief. "If I can get up an argument with him, or place him under accusation, I can form an estimate that will guide me." "There might be a little physical exertion connected with an interview in which he was accused of complicity in the murder," said Chick. "And that would help some. I am feeling in the need of a thumping." "That may come soon enough," replied Nick. "It might be a good idea to watch the room in the tenement," said Chick. "There may be a reason why the woman should go back there." If she does, it will be in the night time, was the reply. We will talk that over later. At this time, we'll see if we can locate this man Mantell. No one appears to know much about the fellow. He may be at the Cumberland, said Chick. Mantell was not at his hotel when the detectives called there, and so they went to the Bowery Café, whence Townsend had gone to his death. Now, said Nick, as they approached the place, if we find him and there are others present, you observe them while I am sizing up Mantell, and I may accuse him of all sorts of things, so be on your guard. The clerk informed Nick that Mantell was at breakfast with a friend in a rear room. Are you certain he has company? Asked Nick. You see, he had an appointment with me at this hour, an important appointment. It is possible that the other fellow is the man we both expected to meet here. What sort of a looking chap is he? It is a woman, said the man at the desk, and he asked particularly that they should not be disturbed. Oh, he'll see me, said Nick, with a swagger affected by precinct detectives. You'll have to get in there the best way you can, then, said the clerk. I'm not going to have you shown in. Oh, that's all right, said Nick. The clerk gave the detectives the number of the room, and they opened the door and entered without even the formality of knocking. Mantell sprang to his feet, rage showing in his eyes. His companion, who hastily dropped a veil over her face as the door was opened, shrank back into her chair and turned her head away. She was slender of figure, and seemed to be rather good-looking. Owing to the thick veil, Nick could not distinguish the full outlines of her face, but what he could see of it gave him the impression that the woman was young and fair of complexion. There was something about the droop of the shoulders, the graceful lines of the waist, which seemed familiar to the detective, yet he could not at that time place the woman. "What do you want in here?" demanded Mantell, springing from his chair. "Have you no eyes? Can't you see that the room is taken?" "Just a moment," said Nick, with a precinct detective swagger. "I'm a police detective, you know." "No, I don't know," replied the other hotly. "But if you are, what is that to me? Have the kindness to leave the room." Chick was looking on in amused wonder. He had never seen his chief play that role before. "I have business with you," said Nick, taking a chair. It seemed to Nick that a shade of anxiety passed over the man's face. "Well, proceed. What is it?" "You were here with Townsend and Maynard last night when the latter was murdered?" asked the detective. "You are wrong," was the reply. "You don't know what you are talking about." "You were not here that night?" asked Nick. "Yes, I was here, but not with Mr. Townsend. He had left the place before I arrived, and I found Maynard waiting for him." "You did not see Townsend that night?" asked Nick, regarding the fellow keenly. Mantell hesitated. He looked like a man who was playing for time. "I was told that you saw him out on the pavement in front of this place," said Nick, at a venture. "Well, what if I did? I do not, at this time, recall the incident, if I did see him. But what of it, if I did?" "I am also informed," said Nick, still making a bluff, "that you saw him pass down the street without making your presence known. Is that true?" "It is not true," was the reply. "We have information at headquarters," continued Nick, "that you walked on to the Wisconsin in his wake, and returned to the café only after the cry that a murder had been committed had been raised in the hotel." "That is not true," said Mantell. "You did not go to the Wisconsin that night?" asked the detective. "I did not," was the reply. "When you left here, leaving Maynard to look up his friend, where did you go?" "That is no affair of yours," was the angry reply. Nick was doing a lot of guessing in his talk with the fellow, but he seemed to be making points. "Didn't you go to the house of an African fortune teller on Houston Street?" asked the detective. "It is a lie!" almost shouted Mantell. "What does all this questioning mean? Am I accused of the murder of Townsend? If so, take me to some competent person for examination. I am sick of your amateur efforts." "All in good time," said Nick. After the destruction by fire of the house occupied by the African fortune-teller, didn't you visit a woman on the 3rd floor of a tenement house near the Bowery?" Mantell started. The woman sitting by his side seemed about to leave her chair, so excited and nervous were her movements. Chick began to see that his chief was no longer feeling around for a clue, but knew what he was about. "I did not visit such a place as you describe," was the reply. "From this café I went directly to my rooms at the Cumberland." "How did you get to your rooms?" asked Nick, at a venture. "The elevator man says you did not ride up in the cage with him." Again the fellow started, as if in sudden terror. Again the woman made a motion which suggested leaving the room. Nick was now playing a bold game. "He is mistaken," said Mantell. "I went to my room in the usual manner." "And the lady sitting there by your side," said Nick. "She—" "Leave her out of it," said Mantell angrily. "She met you later that night, or early the next morning, rather, at—" The woman sprang to her feet, her eyes flashing through her veil. "I won't stay here to be insulted," she said. She started for the door, but Nick stopped her with a gesture. "Wait," he said. "Are you the woman who occupied a room on the 3rd story of a tenement on East Houston Street?" "Let me pass," cried the woman, as Nick stepped in front of her. "I can account for myself to the proper authorities, but not to you." In her rage the woman drew herself up to her full height, and gazed at the detective, with a fierce hate burning in her eyes. "It may be as well for you to remain here and answer a few questions, but you may go if you think best," said Nick. "What do you want?" demanded the woman. "This. When did you first meet Julius Mantell?" Mantell now sprang to his feet. "This is intolerable!" he cried. "I am not detaining you," said Nick. Mantell and the woman turned to the door. "A nice mess you've made of my morning," Julius said. Chapter 20 Flushing the Birds A waiter approached, a tall, dark, slim fellow with evident traces of African blood in his veins. He stepped impudently in front of the detectives as they followed Julius and the woman from the room. His manner was insulting in the extreme. "How did you get into that room?" he demanded. Nick sized up the situation instantly. Some of their conversation had been overheard, and this waiter had been set on to detain them while the man and woman got away. Either that, or assault, perhaps murder, was intended. It was clear that he had made progress during his talk with Mantell. Without replying to the impudent question of the waiter, Nick motioned to him to step aside, and advanced toward the public room, which lay at the end of a wide hall upon which the private room opened. At the rear of the hall was a wide door, opening on an alley. The waiter did not move. He still obstructed the way. Julius and the woman were passing through the outer room toward the street door. "You had no right in there," continued the waiter, angry at the way he was ignored, "and I have a notion to throw you out into the alley." "Mention of the Townsend murder appears to stir things up in this house," said the detective, looking the waiter in the eye. For a second the fellow looked dismayed, but only for a second. Other waiters were now gathering in the hall. The clerk advanced to the scene of trouble. "We can't have quarreling here," he said. "You go back to your work," he added, addressing the waiters, "and you," to the detectives, "make your way out as quietly as possible. I told you not to go into that room." At any rate, thought Nick, the clerk is not in with this play, whatever it is. "He can't come in here and insult my customers," said the waiter, ignoring the protests of the clerk. "I'll pitch him into the alley." "The alley is probably half full of bullies," thought Nick, "and I have no time for a battle now. The waiter is in touch with the syndicate." The waiter seized Nick by the shoulder and hurried him along toward the alley door, and Nick went without resistance. He wanted to see what there was in the alley. Another waiter seized Chick and moved forward with him. It seemed to be the idea to separate the two men. Chick waited until the alley door was open, and then landed a blow on the waiter which laid him unconscious on the floor. Through the doorway leading to the alley, the assistant had observed three muscular men waiting for Nick to be passed out to them. Surely the detective had had good cause to begin a line of inquiries at this place. In a moment Chick was at the side of his chief, who was still inside the restaurant. There was a rush for the place, half a dozen waiters swarming about the two detectives. Chick saw iron knuckles in more than one hand, and understood that the intention was to knock them both out. As he approached, he saw Nick whirl suddenly about, land a knockout blow on the waiter's jaw, and make toward the front of the place. Two waiters were now down, and all was excitement, but no one opposed the exit of the detectives. Two of their crack men had been knocked out, and that was enough to warn the others to be careful. At the door, Nick beckoned to a policeman, a roundsman who knew him well. "I had to do a little hitting in there," he said to the policeman. "Go in and take the two men you will find suffering from too much impudence. Lock them up and keep them apart and away from visitors." The roundsman saluted and passed into the restaurant. "Now," said Nick, "we may as well learn where Julius and the woman go." "I'm afraid they're out of sight," said Chick. "No, they were waiting to see us beaten to a pulp," replied Nick. "They have just left the stairway there at the left, and turned the corner. Keep along after them and track them home. If they separate, follow the woman." Chick hastened away, and Nick made his way to his office, where he found Patsy awaiting him. "I have looked up the details of the 4 diamond robberies," said the assistant, "and here is the report." He handed his chief a typewritten roll of at least 20,000 words. Nick glanced at the length of the document and asked, "How many hands show plainly in these jobs?" "One in the last 3," was the reply. "And all these are of recent occurrence?" "Yes, a very recent occurrence." "And the proof points to a woman?" "Exactly." "What sort of a woman?" "A lady's maid." "Describe her." Patsy laughed as he replied, "That would be a hard thing for me to do, though my wife, Adelina, might satisfy you. Sometimes she is young and fair, again she is old and wrinkled. Now she has abundant black hair, now she has short auburn locks. She seemed to be an expert at disguises, for no one suspected her." "Yet you are certain of your ground?" "Certainly. The face does not always do its duty when disguised. There are features which cannot be changed by art. This girl has a small mole on the right upper lip, just at the corner of the nostril." "That is a very common face blemish." "Exactly, but this girl has tried to secure the removal of this blemish, and it has resented the interference. It is inflamed, and is growing in size." "What else?" "She is young." "How do you know that?" "She looks it. She can't be over 20. "Where did she appear as a young woman?" "At the Burns house." "Go on." "She is slender, and has a fancy for diamonds." "Go on." "Just now she is not in evidence. No one seems to know where she is." "You did not unnecessarily attract attention to her?" "Oh, no. She is not supposed to be suspected. I was looking after a long lost sister." "Can you ascertain where she put in her extra time while out at service?" "I have already done so. She was infatuated with the stage. She went to the theaters, and sought the companionship of actors and actresses. She informed the servants at the Burns house that she was in training for the stage. She may be behind the footlights now. I can't find her at any of the theaters." "Well," said the detective, "about 10 o'clock tonight I may be able to point her out to you. Remain here for the present." In an hour a call from Chick came over the phone. He was in a room opposite a private parlor at the Cumberland. "Our parties are across the hall," he said, "and they seem to be holding a reception. About a dozen people in there now, and more coming." "What sort of people?" "Pretty good-looking lot. Look like hotel clerks, restaurant owners, and racehorse fellows of the better class." "Mantell master of ceremonies?" "He appears to be." "Any way of learning what they are talking about?" "I can't get a single word." "Is Julius dressed just as he was this afternoon at the café?" "Exactly." "All right. I'll be up there in a short time." Nick rang off and made up a bundle from the clothing stored in his dressing room. Then he turned to Patsy. "You saw the clothes I put up?" he asked. "Certainly." "Well, if you see me in that rig, Follow on, wherever I go. Perhaps you had better get on your messenger rig. You can go anywhere in the part of the city where I'm going." Patsy hastened away to prepare his change of apparel. Nick regarded his own disguise ruefully. It was without doubt necessary in this case, but he disliked to go about in the guise of another man. He preferred to win his cases by reasoning them out, rather than by cheap detective methods. As soon as Patsy was ready, Nick took up his bundle with a sigh, and the two made their way to the Cumberland, Patsy following along on the opposite side of the street. "Step into the corridor and note the room I am shown to," said Nick, waiting for the seeming messenger to come up with him at the entrance to the hotel. "After I have been in there a minute, tell the clerk you have a message for the man in that room. Come in armed and ready for a scrap." "A scrap at the Cumberland?" echoed Patsy. "We can't tell what will happen," replied Nick. It was now growing dark, and when Nick entered the room where Chick awaited him, the gas was burning dimly. In a moment the detective had his clothes off and was dressing himself in the ones brought from his office. As the work progressed, Patsy knocked at the door and was admitted. Directly, Nick stood before his assistants ready for action. It seemed to them that it was Mantell who stood there. "It is a hard role to play," said Nick, "because it is difficult to hold my face as Mantell carries his. Anything wrong?" "Not a thing," said Chick. "You look like the original," said Patsy. "Now," said Nick, "I'd like to get in there and hear the talk, but I do not care to risk it, as a failure would ruin all my plans." "What's the game?" asked Patsy. "We'll have to remain here until they leave," was the reply. "That may be at midnight." "Yes, but we must wait." "And then?" "When we see that they are going, the messenger steps out and invites Mantell into this room." "And we put him to sleep, and you step out in his place?" "That's it." "It's a risky thing to do," said Chick. Nick remained silent. Chapter 21. A Clever Woman. "There is no knowing where the trail may lead you," Chick said presently. "I am in hope," said Nick, "that it will lead again to the headquarters of the Great Diamond Syndicate. I have an idea that I would like a short talk with a man I met in the Houston Street house last night." "I wonder what's become of the alleged reporter?" asked Chick. "He appeared to me to be rather an amusing chap." "You'll probably find him with the old duffer who entertained Nick last night," suggested Patsy. "Listen! I think they are passing out." The people in the private parlor were indeed leaving the room, one at a time, and quietly. There was no talking in the hall, and the door was closed after every departure. Nick smiled at the game he was playing. "These syndicate fellows are all right," he said. "It is something worthwhile when you get up against fellows who meet at first-class hotels instead of in some dark basement in the slums." The door to the private room opened and closed again. Nick, who was at the transom, motioned, and Patsy slipped out into the hall and stood some distance from the door. "There are only two left in the room now," said Nick. "They are Mantell and a woman." Again the door opened and Mantell stepped out. The woman was a few paces behind him, but still in the room. Patsy stepped forward from the other end of the hall. "I was just going to the parlor, sir," he said. "I have a message for you." "Deliver it," said Julius shortly. "A call, rather," said Patsy, correcting his mistake. "Well?" "It is a request to call at room 14. That is it. There at the right." Julius made a motion with his hand, and the woman closed the door of the private parlor. He then stepped up to the door of 14 and knocked lightly on the panel. "You asked for me?" he said, as Chick opened the door. Nick was nowhere in sight. The messenger followed on as Julius stepped into the room. It all took place in a second, and Mantell lay bound, gagged, and panting on the carpet. "That was quietly done," said Nick, stepping out of a closet. "I was afraid the noise might attract attention." Mantell almost foamed with rage as he saw Nick, dressed so exactly like himself that it would seem that his best friends must be deceived. Chick mounted a chair and looked through the transom. "You must be going," he said presently. "The woman in the parlor is becoming anxious and keeps opening the door a crack." Nick bent over Mantell, lying helpless on the floor, and took a peculiar-looking pin from his scarf. Then he took a diamond ring from the prisoner's little finger. Mantell squirmed under his bonds, but could not resist. "I can use these to good advantage," said Nick. "And, by the way, Mantell, I think I've seen these before." The prisoner looked as if a little cursing would relieve his mind, but he did not at that time have the power to make a loud sound. "The woman is at the door," said Chick. Nick opened the door and stepped out into the hall. "I was detained a moment in that room," he said, as the woman advanced to meet him. Julius foamed as he realized how exactly the voice reproduced his own. "Looks all right, doesn't he?" asked Chick, as he closed the door. "Now, when they get to the end of the hall, Patsy, you follow on, and I'll see that this fellow is locked up." Patsy moved away, and was soon in full view of Nick and his companion. They were standing in front of a clothing house, and the woman was urging him to make some purchases. The woman had apparently not even glanced at Nick as he appeared in the hall in the guise of Mantell. She had walked at his side until they were clear of the hotel without speaking. Now she said, "It is plain that we must leave the city for a time." "I presume so," said Nick. The woman walked along in silence while Nick wondered what was coming next. He saw no reason for sudden flight on the part of the members of the syndicate. That is, unless they had learned something of his plans. "I don't see why that police detective suspected you," continued the woman. "Why don't you change your clothes and make yourself look different? You poke around in that black suit, looking like a preacher. Fix your hair different and put on a sporty air. You look too solemn." "I must go back to my room to do that," said Nick, realizing that this was just the thing he ought to do, get to Mantell's rooms. But it was not in the mind of the woman that he should reach that suite of rooms. "Here is a clothing store," she said. "Go in and buy what you need. You must not go back to the rooms now. The hotel is probably watched. It's a wonder we all got away from there as we did after the meeting. You buy what you need here, and I'll wait in front of the store. Change your appearance as much as possible." Nick was sorely puzzled. Why should the woman want him to change his clothes? She understood that the officers knew Mantell, and that they would find him if they wanted to do so in whatever suit he might put on. Was it her purpose to escape when he went into the store to change his clothes? That was a risk he could not run, and he hesitated at the store door. Then a messenger in uniform paused at the door, looked at the number, and passed on. "That's Patsy, all right," thought Nick. "Here's for the new clothes. She can't get away so long as he is here. This is a mystery, but I'll solve it." Nick selected a large, light-colored suit and put it on over the Mantell disguise. The hat he retained, for he could not very well conceal the derby he had worn. When he left the dressing room he seemed like another person. The woman looked pleased, and asked where the other clothes were. "I have them where I can get them again," was the reply. Once more in the street, the woman turned at the corner of Houston and walked in the direction of the East River. She seemed strangely agitated over something, and more than once Nick thought she was laughing immoderately. The detective began to think he had caught a Tartar. At least, he could not make up his mind as to what was coming off next. The house she presently entered was in the same block with the ruins of the burned headquarters of the Great Diamond Syndicate. She led the way up a staircase and entered a suite of rooms which faced the street. Closing the door, she laid aside her hat and coat and faced the detective with a smile. She was a handsome woman, tall, slender, and fair of face, but certainly not the one Nick had seen at the café with Mantell. She said, "Well, Mr. Nick Carter." Nick sprang back, but before he could draw a weapon he found himself looking into the muzzle of a loaded revolver. The woman certainly had the drop on him. Then a young man came from an inner room and took the revolver while the woman went through the form of securing Nick's wrists. The detective did not resist. He knew that he could release himself from his bonds at any time. They were not of the kind used by the chief of the Great Diamond Syndicate. This accomplished, the woman stepped back and looked the detective over contemptuously. "You thought I wouldn't recognize you?" she asked. "I certainly did," was the reply. "How did you account for my wearing Mantell's jewelry?" I imagined what had taken place in room 14. "You are a man of action, Mr. Carter, but you have your failings. You neglected to give the sign when we met in the hall." "I was wondering if there were signs in grips," said Nick. "Rather a clever lot of thieves and murderers." "Don't become coarse," said the woman. "Of course we have signs and grips." Then Nick recalled the sign Mantell had made at the café when the waiters came to the private room. It was nothing more than dropping the left hand straight at the side and pointing down with the index finger, the others being closed. Nick knew that he was in no little peril. It was true that he could cast off his bonds at any time, and might even be able to outwit the woman and her companion, but he knew well enough that other members of the syndicate were about. "Are you waiting for someone?" asked Nick, as the woman walked about the room. "Yes, I am waiting for Mantell," was the reply. "You will find him in the tombs," said Nick. "Your plans do not appear to be working to perfection in this case," said the woman mockingly. "Mantell will be rescued on the way to prison." "And when he arrives here?" "Then you will be executed. We shall take no more chances. Do you know that you have given us more trouble than any dozen men ever did?" "Executed," repeated the detective. "You use a fine word to describe the crime of murder." "Executed is the word. You were condemned to death a long time ago." Nick glanced about the room. There seemed to be no way out except by the door at which he had entered. The woman noticed his scrutiny of the place and said: "Oh, we have taken good care that you shall not slip us again. Even if you could get out of the room, you would be killed in the street. Our men are warned, and are anxious to dispose of you." "It seems to me," said Nick, "that I have heard talk something like that before, and in this case, too. Is it the habit of the syndicate to explain its plans to prisoners who are condemned to death? You appear to me to be quite frank in your statements." "The chief made a mistake in talking to you last night, or this morning, rather," replied the woman. "It made us no end of trouble today." The woman arose and walked to the window. To the detective she seemed to be getting nervous. "Do you know," said Nick presently, "that I think you are putting up a bluff, and that you are talking against time? Is Mantell late?" "He'll be here," was the reply. "It would be something of a consolation to me," said Nick, "to know just how you managed to scatter the news of my capture. The others were gone when we left the hotel, before you suspected me, and you have talked with no one since we started." The woman laughed heartily. "What do you suppose I got you into that clothing store for, and into the dressing room? I am agreeably disappointed in you. I thought you much keener." "Then you discovered my identity at once, in the hotel, and summoned your friends while I was changing my clothes? That's clever! What a capital detective you would have made. I should not have left you alone for an instant. You might have escaped. But, then, we all make mistakes." Nick waited anxiously, half expecting the woman to mention the presence of Patsy while she sat at the front of the store. Patsy had certainly been there, but had the woman noted his presence? It was a consolation to the detective to know that the assistant was not far off. "I was afraid you would escape," laughed the woman. "You took the hook easily, Mr. Carter." "You are a clever woman," replied Nick. "I give you the credit of getting the best of me up to date. What next, if I may ask?" "If you could look out of the window," said the woman, facing Euston Street, "you would see 3 men lounging in front of a saloon. They are waiting for signals from this room. Do you begin to realize what a power the Great Diamond Syndicate is? When the waving of a red handkerchief announces that you are dead, they will go away, but they won't expect that signal until they see Mantell enter the house." The detective had no doubt that Patsy was also watching the windows of that house. He would have given much to have communicated with him for an instant. He arose as if to walk to the window. The young man who held the revolver moved forward into the front room. "Get back to your chair," he said, "or we won't wait for Mantell. I prefer to do the job right now, anyway. Get back!" The fellow's tone nettled the detective. Almost before he realized what he was doing, he burst his bonds and sprang at the man. There was a sharp report and a puff of smoke. Then the woman, who had turned from the window in alarm, saw the young man lying unconscious on the floor, and saw, also, that the detective was no longer bound. Nick gazed at the woman steadily for a second. "I don't know what to do with you," he said. "It is not the office of a gentleman to bind and gag a woman, yet something must be done." The woman gazed anxiously in the direction of the door. "Don't expect Mantell," said Nick. "He is in the Tombs by this time." Then a step sounded in the hall outside. "He is coming!" cried the woman. Nick lifted his revolver. "I hope so," he said. The woman gave a scream of warning. Then the door opened, and a messenger's uniform showed in the opening. Patsy was evidently in great haste, and closed the door after him with a bang. "Those fellows across the street are suspicious," he said. "I should not have made a break to get up here except for the pistol shot. Are you hurt?" "Not in the least," replied Nick. "Are the watchers coming up here?" "They started across the street just behind me. Watch the woman." Nick sprang to the front window. The red silk handkerchief lay in a chair, ready for use as a signal. Nick lifted the lower sash and threw the end out to the breeze. It floated for a second in the strong light of the street, and then Nick dropped it. As it fluttered to the pavement below, the detective caught an exclamation of joy from a group of 3 men standing at the very entrance to the house. "There you are," said Nick, turning back into the room with a smile. "I am now dead, and our 3 cutthroats will go away. How are you feeling now, madam?" he added, speaking to the woman, who had thrown herself into a chair and sat looking at the 2 men with rage and hate in her eyes. While Patsy watched the prisoner, Nick made a search of the rooms. He found letters and telegrams by the score. His conclusion was that the Great Diamond Syndicate was using the rooms as headquarters. As he opened a locked drawer in a small secretary, the woman sprang to her feet and fought desperately. "They are private papers there," she cried. "If you are a gentleman, let them alone. Let them alone, I tell you!" "Private papers?" echoed Nick. "I should say so. The private papers of the Great Diamond Syndicate. This is indeed a find." The woman fell back on the floor in a faint. "This looks like easy money," smiled Patsy, with a grin. Chapter 22. The Story Told. The Booth Dramatic Club was holding rehearsal at its rooms on West 14th Street. The rooms were on the top floor of an old-fashioned house, and were nicely fitted up with stage, dressing room, and scenery. The play, long in rehearsal, was to have been presented to the intimate friends of the members of the club that night, but the death of Townsend, the illness of Maynard, and the strange disappearance of 2 young men who held leading parts had made a postponement necessary. There was a stage entrance from a hall which ran along the east side of the house, and at 8 o'clock Nick Carter, in the guise of Mantell, passed through the hall and stepped out on the stage. He was accompanied by Patsy, who carried a large suitcase. "I wonder which is my dressing room," whispered Nick. Patsy looked amused. The 2 detectives had run many risks in getting into the house and up to the rooms of the club, but the test now seemed at hand. "Well," said the assistant, "you've got a leading role, according to the program we found, and you must have a fine dressing room. Wait, I'll just scout around and find a room with your stage costume in it. If I make a mistake, no one will wonder at it, while they would suspect something at once if you got into the wrong room." "There," said Patsy, returning in a moment. "I've located the place and the rig. I hope you'll make a hit in your part tonight. You wear a wig and all that, so no one will suspect you. What luck! Sure I don't play anything? Well, then, I'll be your servant for the night, and sit in the dressing room and watch." Nick dressed in the costume he wore in the play, and went out on the stage. 6 of the members were there, and he nodded at them all, giving the sign with the left hand. They were all too busy with their own affairs to pay special attention to him. Presently a dressing room door opened, and a woman stepped out, clad in silks and blazing with diamonds. She approached Nick, who was glad that at the moment he stood in the shadow of a scene ready for adjustment. The girl was Bernice Bouvet. She looked more beautiful than ever in her costume. In a moment Anton Sautel stood at her side. "Where is Stella?" asked Bernice, laying a hand on Nick's arm. "She should have been here long ago." "Now, who is Stella?" wondered Nick. "She must be the clever woman who captured me this evening. I'll take a chance." "She left me soon after leaving the Cumberland," he said, "saying that she would be here on time. You look superb in those diamonds." Bernice smiled and Anton grinned. "You always admired the Maynard collection," she said. Here was another puzzle for the detective. Had the thieves the nerve to present the stolen diamonds at the rehearsal? Could it be possible that no member of the club, outside those who belonged to the syndicate, knew of the true situation of affairs, of the murder of Townsend and the assault on Maynard? "It strikes me," thought Nick, "that this dramatic club is composed principally of members of the Great Diamond Syndicate." The detective shuddered as Bernice touched him, but he remained in conversation with her for a long time. "There comes the chief," she said presently, pointing to a brisk-appearing man just stepping on the stage. He was accompanied by a young fellow Nick had no difficulty in recognizing as the alleged reporter who had led him to the syndicate headquarters. There was no doubt that the man referred to as the chief was the same one who had planned his death the previous evening. In looking over the members of the club, Nick saw that it was indeed composed mostly of members of the syndicate. The few outsiders who were there were the lambs of the organization. They had either diamonds, money, or social position to thank for their admission. Nick now saw clearly what the club really was, an annex to the syndicate. While the others were at their parts, Nick went back to his dressing room. "What are you going to do when it comes time for you to go on?" asked Patsy. "You don't know a word of the part." "If Chick acts promptly," said Nick, "the big scene will come off before I'm called upon to speak my lines." "It will be something of a surprise party," said Patsy. "Still, there are not so many members of the syndicate here that we know about. You have Mantell, Stella, the two waiters, the guard at the old headquarters, and the man who tried to burglarize your house already under arrest. How many more are there here?" "The chief," replied Nick, "the alleged reporter, Bernice, Anton, and the members of that glee club. Oh, we'll pick them all up if everything goes well." "When does it come off?" "Very shortly now." At that moment there came a knock on the door leading to the hall. One of the members of the club opened it, and 6 men, wearing the white uniforms of caterers' men, walked in, bearing great baskets covered with white cloths. "A surprise!" cried half a dozen voices. "A feed," said Bernice, with a laugh. "Who is responsible for this?" asked the chief. The baskets were placed in the center of the stage, and the members of the company gathered about them. Nick and Patsy stood back where the men who had brought the baskets could see every move they made. Then, when the entire company was bending over the baskets, Nick gave a signal and seized the chief of the Great Diamond Syndicate. There were screams, calls for help, and frantic efforts at escape, but in a moment every member of the club who belonged to the villainous Diamond Syndicate was securely handcuffed. "How was that for a spread?" asked Chick, who had seized Anton. "What does it mean?" demanded the chief, looking hard at Nick, still wearing the stage costume prepared for Mantell. Nick threw off his rig and stood revealed. "I think," said the chief coolly, "that we have met before." "Right you are," said Nick, "and under different circumstances. How do you like the change of positions?" "I should like to have you as a working partner," said the chief. "You are courageous and resourceful, yet you sometimes make mistakes. You have made a scene here tonight, and arrested practically all the members of this club. What charge can you make against us?" The members of the club who had not been arrested now gathered around. "What does this mean?" they asked. They were mostly the sons and daughters of wealthy people, and they would, in time, have fallen victims to the syndicate. "It means," replied Nick, "that you have been associating with murderers and robbers ever since you joined this club." "That is strong talk," said the chief. "Be careful what you say." Bernice Bouvet, who had been standing by Nick's side, now sprang away as if to make her escape by means of a window. "Would you commit suicide?" asked the detective, restraining her. "It would be death to leap from that window." "And it is death to remain here," cried the girl. The next moment she fell in a faint at the feet of the detective. As she sank to the floor, her hair caught on a button of Nick's coat and came off, revealing a short underwig of red hair. "There," said Patsy. "We have found the lady's maid who made up in so many different ways. See, she wore long black hair, then a wig of red, then her own black hair, cut short." "Cut short at the prison," said Nick. The head of the syndicate stepped forward and looked down upon the girl. "I never supposed she lacked nerve," he said. "The electric chair has terrors for all," said Nick. The chief remained silent. By this time the members of the club who were not under arrest were leaving the room, never to return. The prisoners were grouped on one corner of the stage, some of them in the costumes they had prepared for the play, which was now destined never to be presented by the club. Nick picked up jewels as they fell from the unconscious girl. "It seems," he said, "that Bernice cannot prove true even to her associates in crime. All the larger stones here are paste. How the girl substituted them for the real diamonds in one day's time is more than I can tell." The chief of the syndicate and Anton stepped forward in angry wonder. The chief muttered a savage oath. "I have suspected the girl all along," he said. "That is why she has always been followed." "For all that," said Nick, "she was your best assistant. She did her work cleverly and left no clue, as a rule. I can't understand how she came to murder Townsend." "She never did!" shouted Anton. "Wait," said the chief of the syndicate. "We can't protect her in the crime which was not authorized by the syndicate. She murdered Townsend because he recognized her. And she and Mantell, who is now in the Tombs, attempted the life of Maynard because he saw their faces and heard their talk? Is that it?" The chief was silent. "You can't prove what you say," said Anton, bending over the girl, who now showed signs of returning consciousness. "If that fool of a chief would only keep his mouth shut!" "Look here," said Nick. "You say I have no proof. Let me tell you how the crimes were committed. When Anton and Bernice were released from prison, the Great Diamond Syndicate went after them, and they readily agreed to become members of that unlawful organization. They executed the 4 robberies I have named, Bernice playing the part of lady's maid, and Anton following her about as her lover. Then they came to the Maynard diamonds. This dramatic club was formed, and a play, which called for the display of a large number of diamonds, was selected. The conspirators, through Mantell, induced people of wealth to join, Maynard and Townsend among others. Maynard foolishly promised the use of his diamonds, and other members agreed to bring minor collections. At the dress rehearsal last night, Maynard produced his gems. Then the game seemed ready to work. Mantell made an appointment at the African fortune-tellers. By the way, Stella, the fortune-teller, is at present in the Tombs, charged with murder. While Mantell and the gang were making things ready, Maynard and Townsend waited at a cafe. One member of the syndicate overheard what they said about getting rid of the diamonds. Bernice, having more nerve than the others, was appointed to get the stones. She was dressed in man's clothes, because that disguise was believed to be perfect. While the officers were looking for a man who had committed the crime, the guilty one would be back in her own habiliments. You all know how Townsend was followed and murdered. The chief undoubtedly told the truth. Townsend recognized Bernice, even under her disguise, and so was killed. Then the syndicate, terribly frightened, turned its energies toward defense. It was thought best to watch and destroy the detective who took the case in hand. But they did not expect that work would begin so soon. They were expecting a police detective. I was led to the headquarters of the syndicate, you all know how, and escaped. When the headquarters were burned for the purpose of destroying the records, Bernice was at the Wisconsin with Mantell, trying to find a ring she had lost in the room where the murder was committed. She did not find it, because I picked it up on my first visit to the place. I knew then whose ring it was. I had seen her wear it at the Maynard home when she was a maid there. On their way out of the hotel, the elevator boy gave them the suit of clothes she had worn and which I had committed to the charge of the clerk. The girl opened her eyes and rose slowly to her feet. "You are telling a mess of lies," she said. "The suit you wore when you murdered Townsend," said Nick, "is now at my office. I found it in the closet off Stella's room on Houston Street. Anton bought it in Paris, and it was made over to fit you. The suit of Townsend's, which you wore away, was found in the same place." "If they were in Stella's room, why don't you accuse her of the murder?" demanded Anton. "Because the chief admits that Bernice committed the crime," was the reply. "If she goes to the electric chair, he shall go with her," said the young man significantly. "He is as guilty as anyone." The chief of the syndicate sprang forward. "You traitor!" he shouted. "You are telling lies." "Lies?" echoed Anton. "Who planned the murder of the elevator boy after he had been bribed and used? You did, and Stella threw the jar from the window of her room when he passed along there, directed to that place by you." "That is just the proof I have been looking for," said Nick. "My friend, the chief, would have made way with me last night. It gives me great pleasure to send him to the Tombs on charge of murder." The chief of the diamond thieves, who had been so vain and so confident of his own ability only a short time before, now cringed with terror. "They all had a hand in the affair of the boy," he shouted. "We passed upon the matter at a full meeting of the local branch of the syndicate. If I go to the electric chair, they go with me." "I would go willingly," said Bernice, "if I could take this devil of a detective with me. You thought yourselves able to outwit him. See what has come to you." "At any rate," said Chick, "the Great Diamond Syndicate tried its best, and at one time I thought we were up against a stiff game. You see," he added, "all the clues in this case have been supplied by members of the syndicate." "Bad management!" shouted Anton. "I knew it all along. I told you what Nick Carter could do, and yet you allowed him to live when you had him bound." "I don't believe that is Nick Carter," said another. "I waited under Stella's window tonight and received from her a signal showing that he had been killed." "You're a fool!" shouted Anton. "That signal was given by Nick Carter himself to get rid of you. Your Stella is in the Tombs. Why he wasn't killed in that room is more than I know." "Because," replied Nick with a smile, "they waited for the arrival of a man who had the nerve to do the killing, and that man was in the Tombs." "This ends the Great Diamond Syndicate," said Chick. "You are mistaken," cried the chief. "The syndicate will live on, and will train men to hate Nick Carter, to murder him." The detective smiled and took a package of papers from his pocket. "You are wrong again," he said. "Here are the records of the syndicate. Not 2 hours ago I filed a duplicate with the chief of police. By this time, every person in New York, in any way connected with the syndicate, is either under arrest or under surveillance. Your game is played out, gentlemen." The prisoners were now handcuffed together and marched off to police headquarters. "That closes the battle," cried Chick. "Not just yet," replied Nick quietly. "There are names here that need attention." As he spoke, the detective waved the records of the syndicate in his hand. "They not only need attention, but they will get it at once. It has been an interesting game so far. Now let us push it through to the end. There was never much mystery concerning the murder. I could have named the murderer of Townsend within an hour after viewing his body, but the girl had to be found before a word was said. Then came the developments concerning the Great Diamond Syndicate, and that organization had to be cleaned up." "Why were you so sure of Mantell after the interview at the café?" asked Chick. "I know he rather overdid the thing there, but still I could see no proof." "When I lay on the couch in the rooms of the syndicate," replied Nick, "I saw some peculiar jewelry lying on the chief's desk. Well, Mantell wore that identical jewelry at the café. I could not believe it at first, for I did not remember seeing the chief take the stuff away in the hurry of his departure." "But it was the same?" It certainly was. I saw that when I took the pin and the ring from Mantell tonight. Well, you see how that connected him with the syndicate? And there never was any doubt that the syndicate was at the bottom of the murder. Chapter 23. The Den of the Syndicate. "And now what is the layout, Nick?" asked Chick, when the prisoners had been disposed of, and the detectives had returned to Nick's house. "To clean out the den of the syndicate. I thought the fire did that." "But there is another, where the smaller fry hang out, as his record shows," replied Nick again, referring to the paper. "To be sure, there are only the little fellows left, but great oaks from little acorns grow, Chick, and I think we had better make a clean roundup while we are about it." "And what are your plans?" "You know the Dominion Saloon?" "Sure. It's a crooked joint, although the police have never been able to get a line on it." "Right you are, Chick. Well, that is the hangout for the little fellows of the syndicate. I want you to go there and try and get a job as a waiter or helper of some sort. They are always putting on extras there. Get into a good disguise, and I will join you later." Without further parley, Chick went into the costume room, and within half an hour he was on his way to the Dominion. It was some time later when Nick followed him, also in disguise. He took a cab, and was soon within a block of the saloon, a resort that was operated in the interests of one of the toughest gangs in New York. Here he dismissed the cab and strolled up to the place he sought. He did not enter immediately, however. Pretending to be under the influence of liquor, he stood for a time in front of the place, hands in pockets, glancing tipsily at the show posters in the windows. A perfect procession of crooks was passing into the place, and Nick was waiting to attract the attention of some of them. Presently he had his wish, for a confidence man known to the crooked profession as Blister called him to the doorway. "Hello, there!" cried the crook. "You can't see half of the show from the outside. Come in and have a bracer." Nick looked up with a drunken dignity which set the crook laughing. "I don't know you," he said. "Come in and get acquainted, then," was the laughing reply. "What do you expect to get standing out there looking at the paper lions? You can see the real thing on the inside. Admission free. Come and have a snifter." "You're all right," cried Nick. "I'm choice of me company, but I'll have a drink with you. You're all right." They walked into the place together and took seats at a table. The room was a large one, and was well filled with customers. In front was a cigar stand, shut off from the room proper by a high screen with mirror panels. Back of this was a long bar, and all along the side and clustered in the rear were tables. Just at the end of the bar, an open staircase led to the rooms above. Sitting at the table with the confidence man, Nick saw Chick passing up and down the staircase with beer and wine on trays. The assistant gave a quick glance at his chief, but did not seem to recognize him. Nick does not drink intoxicating liquor, so when the wine was brought at the command of the crook, he was seized with a coughing fit, and succeeded in spilling most of the contents of his glass. "We'll have another," said the detective, drawing forth a roll of banknotes, which caused the eyes of the confidence man to open wide. The fellow thought that the money was certain to come his way before the night was over. Glancing about the room, Nick saw that those present were gathered in little groups, talking earnestly and in whispers. They all appeared to be very well known to each other. Nick noticed that two muscular fellows kept near the door. The confidence man bought several drinks, and then began talking about a little game that was going on upstairs. "I'm going up and play a few stacks," he said. "It's dull down here. You may come along and look on if you want to. Don't get into any game with strangers, however," he added, "for there are some pretty tough chaps here tonight. If you want to play a small game, I'll get you a seat at my table after a while." Nick was not ready to leave the lower room, so he put the crook off and sat with his eyes on the door. Presently 4 men entered the place, drank at the bar, and then started up the staircase. Nick saw that they were strangers there, judging by the attitude of the others in the room. They were tall, broad-shouldered men, and all wore full beards. It was plain that they were armed. One of the men behind the bar called to the men as they started up the staircase. "Where are you going?" he asked, stepping toward them. "To the wine room," was the reply. "Those are private rooms," said the attendant. "You can't go up there tonight." The muscular fellows who had been watching at the door now advanced to the foot of the stairs. As they did so, 4 roughly dressed men entered and stepped back to the inner end of the bar. "There seems to be a little row between the remaining members of the syndicate," thought Nick. "Well, when thieves fall out, honest men get their dues." "Why can't we go up?" demanded one of the men. "We have been there before." "Not tonight," said the attendant. "Take seats down here." The men hesitated. Then they saw that the people in the place were gathering about them with threatening looks, and took chairs at a table, the 8 close together. The crook who was sitting with Nick arose and moved up to the bar, where he stood whispering to the man in charge. As he did so, Chick walked up to Nick as if to take an order. "When the row begins," he said, "go to the back end of the room. I'll be there. We'll go up by the private staircase. I know where to take you." Nick nodded, and Chick brought 2 glasses of wine and placed them on the table. Before the crook returned to his chair, however, the rush was made. Nick saw the gang springing for the stairs, drawing their revolvers as they went, and made for the back of the room, where Chick awaited him. There came a shot, and in an instant the lights were out. Then followed more shots on the stairs, and a police call sounded. The detective heard the men breaking in the door at the head of the stairs, and then came more shooting in the hall above. All was confusion in the room below. Chapter 24. What Nick Overheard. As the detective started up the stairs, which were not lighted, a woman's voice came from above. "Who is there?" she asked. Chick crowded past his chief before he replied. "Waiter!" "What is going on down there?" was the next question. "There's a gang of toughs making for the wine rooms." There was a short silence, during which the detectives crept noiselessly up the stairs. In a moment Nick could feel the woman's skirt by reaching over Chick's shoulders. The gang was not yet in the hall connecting with the private stairs. "Send Jim up to my room," said the woman presently. "All right." The woman was heard moving away, and the detectives followed her. She passed down a narrow hall running toward an annex in the rear of the building. Presently she opened a door, and the passage was flooded with light. The electrics in the annex had not been switched off. The woman uttered a cry of alarm when she saw 2 men were following her, one in the uniform of a waiter and the other a stranger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Go back and send Jim up." "Who is that with you?" "Friend," replied Chick. "Businessman, and I brought him up so he wouldn't get pinched. Put him away somewhere." Chick made a sly motion toward his pocket. The woman understood. Many a man had been robbed in that place. "I see," replied the woman. "Bring him in here." She stepped into the room and motioned for the detectives to follow. Nick now appeared to be very much intoxicated, and Chick helped him along. The woman pointed to a small room at the side. "Take him in there," she said. "Then go and call Jim." Nick was thinking fast. His first impulse was to secure the woman against outcry and make for the front of the building. As Nick mused, studying out the problem, another woman's voice was heard in the room he had first entered. The door between the 2 rooms was open, and he heard the newcomer saying, "This will end the business for the whole crowd. Idle police are out there with guns and nightsticks. I guess the whole place will be pinched. They can't get in here, however. Everything safe?" There was no reply that Nick could hear, but the woman was evidently warned that a stranger was in the next room, for she began speaking in whispers. Nick began to snore loudly. "Asleep," whispered the woman. "Drunk," said the other, "and he has a roll as big as a stovepipe." Nick leaned back in his chair with his eyes shut, but he knew that the woman was standing in the doorway looking him over. "I wonder why Jim doesn't come?" asked the woman who had admitted Nick to the room. "I sent a waiter after him." "I presume he is busy," was the reply. "There is a big fight on out there." "What is it all about?" Why, the gang believes that Huggart squealed to Carter and caused the arrest of the big chief. They want him." "But he didn't." "That's true enough, but you can't make the gang believe it." Nick began to wait with impatience for the return of Chick. There was now no shooting in front, but a good deal of running around was heard, and doors were slamming, as if a general search or chase was on. Fretting over his enforced inactivity, Nick decided to try a new plan. With a loud snort, he fell from his chair and lay like a log on the floor. One of the women came to the doorway. "The drunken brute!" she cried. "We must throw him into the back room." Acting on this suggestion, the woman seized Nick and dragged him over a doorsill and left him. Then he heard a door close. Opening his eyes cautiously, he found himself in utter darkness. The room was undoubtedly an inside one, for no windows were in sight. He arose to his feet in order to get his bearings, if possible. As he did so, the room was flooded with light from electric globes far up on the wall, and a voice said: "You awoke suddenly." It was the voice of one of the women who had been talking while he sat in the next room. Nick looked about. There was no one in sight. "Sit down in that chair in the middle of the room," commanded the voice. "You will be shot if you try any of your games." To say that Nick was disgusted with himself, but feebly expresses his feelings. At the critical moment he had permitted a woman to outwit him. "I am not in the killing business myself," said the woman, "but there will soon be a person here who has no scruples in getting rid of spies and murderers." Nick took the chair without a word. His hope was now in Chick. "You're after Huggart, are you?" she asked. "You know what we want," replied Nick. "Why not make it an even thing for both sides?" "Oh, you want to compromise, do you?" sneered the woman. "That bum waiter you sneaked in here got his a moment ago, and the rest of your crowd has just been taken away by the police." The detective did not believe this. There was still too much excitement at the front of the building. Presently the noise grew louder, seeming to come from the room in which Chick had left him. Then the lights were shut off, and again he was in darkness. He heard the sounds of a struggle, but had no means of knowing whether it was the police or the syndicate gang. Then came a shout: "Kick in the doors, boys. He is here somewhere." This was followed by heavy blows, and a door fell with a crash. Then another, and in a second the door to the room where he sat was attacked. He sprang to a corner of the room and waited, his revolver ready at his hand. When the door fell, 3 men bounded into the room. They were not policemen, but members of the syndicate. One of the men advanced towards Nick. "Here he is," he shouted. "Now, hurry up! It's a fight to get out, I suppose." Chapter 25 A Desperate Raid Nick was dragged to the square of light in front of the open doorway. He appeared to be still under the influence of liquor. The men regarded him with rage and dismay, holding him fast in the meantime. "This is not the man we want," one of them shouted. "Who are you?" demanded another. Sounds of advancing footsteps were now heard from the direction of the private staircase. "Quick!" cried one of the men, seizing Nick by the throat. "Is there any way out of this cursed hole? The cops are after us." "They brought me here to rob me," faltered the detective, "and I can't find the way out." "Some cheap sport!" cried one of the gang. "Come on, boys!" But Nick had no idea of permitting the men to escape. He had no way of knowing how many members of the gang had been taken by the police, but he was determined that these 3 should not get away. He knew that in such dens as he then found himself there were often double doors, the second one of metal and sliding down from the upper casing. The Dominion had for years been the resort of thieves and murderers, and it would not be strange if something of the kind should exist in the room where, he had no doubt, many persons had been shot from the secret panel from which he had been threatened. In fact, the very presence of the secret panel convinced him that the room was not protected by only a wooden door. If anything of the sort existed, there should be a push button on the outer casing. He was already in the doorway, where he had been thrust by the gang for close inspection, and before they could move out he made a quick examination. The button was there, and he stepped outside and pressed it. As he expected, a metal door slid from above and covered the opening. The women had been too sure of him to use the door, and had been too excited to think of it when the gang arrived. As the metal door shot down, Nick saw Chick in the room behind him, but he disappeared in an instant, much to the amazement of the detective. Then a familiar voice came from beyond the door. "Throw up your hands in there. I have you covered." Then Nick remembered that Chick had informed him that he was thoroughly posted regarding the Dominion. The means used to trap victims was now being used in the interest of the law. Chick was there at the secret panel. Nick wondered if the outlaws were obeying orders. He looked about for some way of reaching Chick, and saw a door at the left of the metal one. Opening this, the detective found himself in a narrow hallway, at the end of which stood his assistant, with 2 revolvers pointing through the little opening. "You're a brick!" cried Nick. "What are they doing?" "Holding up their hands," was the grim reply. "Hold them a moment," said Nick. He stepped back to the room where he had left the women. "Where are the police?" asked the detective. "Sending crooks in by wagon loads," was the reply. "Oh, you are detectives, are you?" said one of the women. Then she turned to Nick. "I would have killed you had I known," she said angrily. "By the way," said Nick, addressing the woman, "you may as well tell us where you have hidden Huggart." "I know nothing about any such man," came the scornful reply. "The boys will be back here soon, and then you will get what's coming to you. The police are in charge of the place." "But they didn't get here in time," sneered the woman. This meant, if it meant anything, that Huggart had gotten away before the raid, or while it was in progress. "Don't be too sure of that," was his reply. "The police would never have thought of coming here," stormed the woman. "It remained for you to come sneaking in like a man ashamed of himself." Nick had learned what he wanted to know. The police were in charge of the front part of the building, and were not likely to come there unless sent for. The crooks were scattered or under arrest, and the crooks had made themselves scarce, at least those who remained at liberty had. There was now no danger of his being disturbed in carrying out the plans he had decided upon. Taking a position at the panel, he asked, "Now who has the top hand?" The crooks swore volubly, and Nick laughed. "I'm coming in there now to disarm you," said Nick. "But I leave a chap here who can do pretty good shooting. The man who resists will be killed." Then, turning to Chick, he asked, "How many pair of handcuffs have you?" "2, but—" "Never mind that," interrupted Nick. "You stay here and shoot if one of them lifts a finger. I'll lock the women in a closet." This plan was adopted, and in 5 minutes the 3 crooks were disarmed and handcuffed. "I don't believe you're a New York policeman," said one of the men, glaring at Nick. "They don't do things in this way. We have been operating here quite a time, and this is our first experience of this kind." "You are not discreet," smiled Nick as he handcuffed them. The sound of angry words now came from the room where Chick had been left in charge of the 2 prisoners and the women. Nick opened the door and looked out. A heavily built man with a mustache dyed black and an evil face was shaking a huge fist at the women. "You've robbed me," he was saying, "and I now give you in charge of these officers. You saw your chance when things were getting mixed, and took every dollar from the safe. You're nice people, you are." The women looked the man over scornfully and maintained a discreet silence. The tough turned to Nick. "I remember you," he said. "You came into the place tonight just before the raid, and you made for this room when the row started. That man there," pointing to Chick, "hired out as a waiter early in the evening. You are detectives, I suppose?" "You have guessed it," replied Chick. "Well, I want you to arrest these women. They have robbed the safe of $10,000. I will appear against them." "When was this money taken?" asked Nick. "Sometime during the evening." "But the women have been here ever since the row started." "Then they took the money before that time. They might have taken it during the afternoon, for all I know. They had chances enough if they knew the combination, and they must have learned that, or they could not have taken it all, for the safe was locked." "Where is the safe?" asked Nick. In a little room at the back end of the saloon. Near the private staircase? Close to it. Is your name Jim? Asked the detective. Not for a minute, was the reply. Jim is the bartender. Nick glanced at the women. They threw him an appealing glance and turned their eyes away. Perhaps he took the money, suggested Nick. He wasn't here until just before the row began, was the reply. Where is he now? Asked Nick. I don't know. The police closed the place. As the fellow spoke, he glared angrily at the prisoners. It was evident that he knew something of the cause of the raid. These men came here, said Nick, looking for a man named Huggard. Where is Huggard? I don't know anything about him, was the angry reply. What I want now is my money, and I want these women and their rooms searched. Search them, then, said Nick. You know the rooms better than we do. We can look through the rooms later, after the women are taken away, said the proprietor. But I want the women searched now. I believe they have my money on their persons. They will be searched at headquarters, replied the detective. Well, continued the enraged owner of the place, if you have done your work here, I want you to get out. I must get things in shape again. The women flushed painfully when they heard the mention of police headquarters. I never took his money, one of them said. I don't believe he ever had the sum he mentions. I am willing to be searched now, said the other. Speaking of this Huggard, said the proprietor, Molly, that woman there, pointing to the one Nick desired to question closely in time. That woman Molly is the one who had the scheme on with him. She knows where he is if anyone does. Where was she last night? Asked Nick. I don't know where she was. She was not seen about the place. I was in my room, replied Molly. I know better, declared the proprietor. You were out all evening. Come, now, you dig down and produce that money, or I'll send you over the road. I haven't got your money, declared Molly. And when it comes to talk about sending me over the road, that is a game two can play at. You had better be careful what you say and do, Ben Hall. If you accuse me of taking your money, I'll get even with you, and you may depend upon it. Angry as he was over his loss, Hall hesitated. I may be mistaken, he said finally, turning to Nick. I think I was a little hasty. If you'll give me a chance to talk with Molly alone, I think we can fix it up. Not at present, was Nick's reply. Then he added, You do not accuse the other woman? Carrie? No, Carrie's all right. I don't know as Molly took the money, but it looks suspicious. Then there is nothing to hold Carrie for? Not a thing, and you may as well release Molly, too. We can square our little matter between ourselves. I'll have to hold Molly, said Nick. Molly looked disappointed. In a moment she turned and whispered to Carrie, taking good care that not a word should be overheard. She spoke rapidly, and Carrie nodded now and then to show that she understood. What is all this talk about? Demanded Hall. I'm sending her after a lawyer and a bondsman, and after my laundry, replied Molly, with warmth. You don't think I'm going to remain in jail, do you? Oh, I'll attend to that, said Hall. Indeed you won't, said the woman. You've got your foot in it now, and you'll kindly let me alone. I'll attend to you later. What have I said? Asked Hall. You said I was mixed up in the scheme to throw down the chief. I wasn't. Yes, you were, roared Hall. And the boys think you are trying to throw them down. You can't square yourself with them very easily. I can tell you that. I don't care what the boys think, said Molly. Where were you this afternoon, Molly? Asked Nick. Right here. All the time? I never left the place. I have been here all day. Nick turned to his assistant. Take the men away, he said. Be careful how you handle them, for they are a bad lot. See them locked up at headquarters, and then return. That looks like you wanted these rooms for an office, grunted Hall. And when you get to the street, continued Nick, turning to Chick, send 2 policemen here to guard these rooms. Station them at the outer door there. Hall turned away with an oath and went back to his wrecked barroom. After a short talk with his chief, which was not heard by the others, Chick went away with the prisoners. Nick waited until the policeman arrived. Then, leaving Carrie in charge of one of them, he called Molly aside. "Where is Hall's money?" he asked. The angry woman refused to answer, nor would she tell anything about the whereabouts of Huggart. Chapter 26. Nick Takes a Chance. Finally there came a knock on the door. Nick opened it and looked out. Chick stood there. "They are landed, all right," he said. Nick drew him aside. "In 5 minutes' time," he said. "Release Carrie, and see that she leaves by the side door of the saloon. I will be there to pick her up. Then leave the policemen here to guard these rooms, and take Molly to the house. This place may have to be searched later." "Unless I am very much mistaken," said Chick, "a couple of those crooks are watching about the place. You may have company if you follow Carrie." "So much the better," replied Nick. 5 minutes later Carrie emerged from the side door of the saloon and turned toward the East River. At the same time, a man in a modest suit of dark brown whirled into the side street and moved along rapidly, whistling and swinging a cane as he walked. 2 men standing across the street followed along in the shadows. The detective's disguise was a good one. He had turned his reversible suit, removed his false mustache, washed the convivial red from his cheeks, and lined his face just a trifle, in order to make himself look older and thinner. No one who had seen him at Hall's place would have recognized him now. He passed Carrie at a swinging pace and turned at the next corner. There he waited in a convenient doorway for her to pass. As she did so, the 2 men crossed to the north side of the street, upon which the girl was walking, and followed on behind her. Nick crossed to the south side of the street and walked along in silence, keeping abreast of the girl. "This is rather a chestnut," he mused, releasing a suspect and following after, "and Carrie may not go to Huggart. Yet she is not a very wise person, and I am sure that Molly told her to communicate with him." Nick knew very well that the 2 men who were following the girl were on the same mission as himself. The gang had not yet given up the notion of finding Huggart. They had shown both nerve and cunning in the game, as far as it had been played, and he looked for some unusual developments from them before the night was over. Their presence complicated matters, but the detective could only follow on and take chances when the time came. After walking several blocks, Carrie entered an all-night restaurant not far from the river, and seated herself at a table. From the opposite side of the street, Nick saw the trailers peering through the windows of the place, evidently in doubt as to the advisability of entering. Carrie ordered a cup of coffee and a sandwich. The waiter who brought them remained at the table for a moment, and then talked briefly with a sporty-looking fellow who sat behind the desk, apparently the cashier. Nick sauntered in and took a stool at the lunch counter, not far from the table where the girl sat. As he did so, the cashier approached the girl and opened a whispered conversation with her. "You'd better cut it all out," Nick heard him say. "According to your own story, things are getting mixed." Carrie whispered something which the detective could not hear. Then the cashier said, "Like a wild man. Getting tired of waiting, I guess." Another whisper from the girl. "No, he has not been down here. Afraid, I guess. You keep out of it." The girl bent closer and whispered at length. "I'll take the message," said the cashier next. Nick paid his bill and left the place. The 2 watchers were still on the opposite side of the street. As soon as Nick passed the square of light in front of the restaurant, he turned into a stairway which led to the upper part of the building, which was only 3 stories in height and without an elevator. The hallway was not lighted, and, as soon as the detective stepped inside, he was in darkness, broken only by a dim light coming through a transom over a door connecting with the restaurant. Turning to look back, he saw that the watchers were crossing the street. Fearful that they might seek shelter in the stairway, and so discover him, Nick passed on to the first landing. There was a dim light here, but the transoms above the doors showed that the rooms opening from the hall were in darkness. He passed on up the second flight of stairs and found himself in a narrow hallway with a window at each end. Lights showed in all the 4 rooms on that floor. Nick went to the back window and looked out. There was a fire escape there, and he stepped out and hung to the rungs, his head on a level with the window sill. The windows of the rear room were open, and the detective heard voices. They did not appear to come from that room, however, but from an inner one next to it. The fire escape was available from the windows of the back room, and Nick moved along and looked in. As he suspected, there was no one there. He could not see into the inner room, for the door was not in line with the window. There was, however, a door in line, the door of a closet, and this was ajar. "It is up to me to take a chance," muttered Nick, and in a second he was in the room, making for the closet. Before he reached the place of shelter, however, a figure appeared in the doorway connecting with the inner room. Then a man sprang forward. In an instant Nick had his revolver leveled. "I have been looking for you, Mr. Huggart," Nick said coolly. "You may as well come with me." Then a woman's scream came from the inner room, and Carrie appeared in the doorway. She had gained the room by means of a stairway from the restaurant. The detective confronted the pair with his threatening revolver. "Not a word," he said. "Come. We want you, Huggart." "What for?" demanded the miner. "You'll learn that in time," was the reply. "And if I refuse to go?" "Then you will be taken by force." Then Nick scented danger. He saw the eyes of the pair travel past him and fix themselves on the door leading to the hall. It is an old trick to place a person off guard, but this looked real to the detective. The terror in Huggart's eyes was not simulated. Without lowering his weapon, Nick turned about. He was too late. As he did so, a noose fell over his shoulders. The rope was drawn taut, with the detective's hands and arms between it and his body. Huggart and the girl sprang for the inner room as the rope fell, but one of the men, gun in hand, barred the way. "Well, Huggart," he said viciously, "it has come to a showdown at last." "What do you want?" demanded the miner. "We want you." Huggart made a sudden spring for the man, avoided the shot, and grappled him. The man who had been guarding Nick sprang forward to help his companion, and in a second the detective was out of the rope and in the fight. Before the second man could draw his gun, Nick landed a heavy blow on the jaw, which sent him to the floor like a dead man. Huggart was fighting like a madman, but would have been bested had the detective not hastened to his assistance, settling the outlaw with a terrific blow. Huggart gazed at the detective in amazement. Chapter 27. Bully Comes to Grief. "That was quick work," said Huggart, "but I did not expect to see you helping me." "I had an idea," replied the detective, "that I wanted a little of your society myself, and so do the police." "Who's talking about the police?" said a voice. At the next moment a burly man appeared in the doorway of the inner room. He was almost a giant, and carried himself with the air of a fighter. The muscles on his arms and neck stood out like cords, and there was an ugly leer on his face. "I am talking about the police," replied Nick. "Go chase yourself," thundered the bouncer. "You can't bring no police up here while I'm around." Nick saw that there was trouble ahead, and got ready for it. Huggart turned away. "Wait," said Nick. "You are going with me as soon as these men are taken care of." "He don't have to go unless he wants to," sneered the bouncer. "You can't come up here and run this place." Huggart turned back and said, "I have no idea of going with you. You helped me out here, a moment ago, and I thank you for that, but here our ways part." Nick was in rather a tight box, for he did not know but the crooks might regain consciousness in a minute and come to the assistance of the bully. Whatever was done must be done at once. He turned to Huggart. "You are wanted as a witness in the case against the chief of the Diamond Syndicate," he said, "and you may as well come along without making trouble." "The Diamond Syndicate?" echoed the miner. "What do I know about a Diamond Syndicate?" "You know all about it," replied Nick. "This is the first I have heard of it," said the man. a look of fear on his face. It was easy to see that the man was lying. "He's giving you gruff," roared the bouncer. "Shall I put him out?" Nick was getting angry. The developments of the night had convinced the detective that Huggert would make trouble if an attempt to take him by force was made. "Get out!" roared the bouncer. "Don't be kicking up a row here." Nick stepped backward to the door opening into the hall and gave a shrill call on his police whistle. In a second the bouncer was making for him, not with a weapon, but with his brawny fists, which had doubtless put more than one man out of business. Nick met him halfway. The fellow put up his hands in prize-ring style, but it was of little avail. Nick is a past master in the art of boxing, and the bouncer went to the floor to join the crooks. Then Nick found himself threatened with a revolver in the hands of Huggert. The girl screamed and covered her face with her hands. Huggert turned for a second to warn her against making an outcry, and that was enough. He went down under a crashing blow. Carrie gave a scream of fright and anger as Huggert fell, and turned toward the inner stairs leading to the restaurant. "It looks like a slaughterhouse," she said. And, indeed, she was not far from right. There were 4 men on the floor whom the detective had put out of business for the time being. He smiled as he thought what would have resulted had they all attacked him at once. "Wait until the police come," said Nick to the girl. "You are to go with me." "Indeed I'm not," was the angry reply. "I was arrested once today, and they were glad to let me go." "Where do you wish to go?" asked Nick. "Do you want to communicate the news to your friend Molly, who sent you here?" "I don't know what you are talking about," said the girl. "Come, come," said Nick. "I am the officer who had you under arrest up at Hall's place. You were released in order that you might show the way to Huggert's hiding place. Molly, by the way, has been taken to my house, and you can see her there." The girl stepped back in wonder. "You must be Nick Carter," she said. "No other man could so disguise himself and do what you have done here." "The same, at your service," replied Nick, with a laugh. "Then I suppose I'll have to go with you," said the girl. "But you won't get anything out of me." Presently the police came, 2 patrolmen who had heard the whistle. Nick made himself known, told them to see that the crooks were taken to police headquarters, and asked one of them to call a carriage. Huggert was still unconscious from the blow he had received, and had to be carried to the vehicle. "You gave him a good one," grinned one of the officers. "It was that or nothing," replied Nick. "See that these men are safely handcuffed and locked up. When the wagon comes, one of you remain here and close the place." The officer pointed to the bouncer. "What about this one?" he asked. "Lock him up," was the brief reply. "There are plenty of charges to make against him. He's a tough, but not so tough as he thinks he is." Arrived at Nick's house, Huggert and Carrie were placed in separate rooms. The latter at once asked for Molly, but was not permitted to see her at that time. Huggert was beginning to show signs of consciousness. Chick appeared as Nick entered his study. "You are making quite a collection tonight," he said. "Molly is making things hum in that little room." "What does she say?" "That you shall be made to suffer for her detention." "That is cheerful," said Nick. "Has she been searched?" "Yes. Mrs. Knight left her not long ago." "She found the money?" "Certainly." "I am sorry for the woman," mused Nick. "She is in bad shape just now." Although Huggert had been suspected, without cause, by his companions in the syndicate, under Nick Carter's 3rd degree he confessed everything, with the result that the detective was able to make a strong case against the gang. The small fry, as Nick called them, it was proven had nothing to do with the murder, and all escaped with sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Bernice escaped the penalty of the law by committing suicide in her cell. The chief of the diamond thieves, Anton, and Stella went to the electric chair. The large diamonds which had been removed from the Maynard collection by Bernice were never found. After rounding up the syndicate, Nick refused to engage in a hunt for the diamonds. The case was fairly won, but the famous detective declares to this day that the cleverest criminals he ever encountered belonged to the Great Diamond Syndicate. End of the Great Diamond Syndicate by Nicholas Carter.